Hello and a good day to all of you, ladies and gentlemen. I'm so excited to be here to talk to you today about personalization. And I'm also excited because there is so much talk of technology today and technology and marketing, and that is, of course, right up my alley. And I think it's a recognition by our agency and by our network as well, of the centrality of technology. And there's so much nerdy stuff happening here that it geeks me out. And the reason it geeks me out and the reason that there is so much technology in marketing today is because marketing is filled with challenging problems. And challenging problems attract nerds like bees to honey, right? We are all in for this, and that's really what we're about. So, and that's why I'm here, and that's why our technology team at iProspect is here, is to help solve problems with technology, whether that's your technology, the platforms we build, our partner platforms, we're here to address those. And certainly personalization is a big, big challenge. So let's talk about personalization in the context, as we've talked about since really the beginning of the day with Gerd and Jeremy before him, about preparing for the future. Okay, so if you think about the messaging we hear in our industry today about personalization, it's a couple different messages, and they're not always in accordance with one another, right? There is this idea of the centrality, importance of personalization, and maybe it's a C-level executive that should be responsible for it. But we also are cautioned, and certainly this is the week of GDPR, about being careful with our data and privacy. And then this sort of last message around like, hey, this is an opportunity that's missed, and do you have control? You, sir, do you have control of your data? So we're tackling all of those issues, and I guess when I talk about personalization, I want to sort of take a little bit of the air out of that bag of anxiety and expectation and challenge, and talk about, at a more brass tacks level, what's involved in doing personalization at scale. So what is personalization? Most of the time, when you get asked questions about personalization and you're reading witty blog posts or white papers or talking to experts, you get a definition like this, which if you're already starting to tweet or copy down, it's a trick, please don't. To me, the simplest answers or simplest definitions are ones that are very, very descriptive and short and brief. So go consult the good old Oxford English Dictionary and get personalization as simply the process of designing or tailoring something to meet a specific individual's expectations, needs, or preferences. At the end of the day, that's really all that it's about, okay? And when we ask ourselves who's good at doing this inside our industry and talking to consumers, obviously Amazon was the pioneer in this space. So we're all familiar with the massive inductive reasoning capability of figuring out what you've bought, what other people have bought, how those products relate to one another that Amazon does every day, and it's wonderful. But we also see more recently a much more direct method, right? This is a company that sells pet products. And they come right out of the gate, pretty much as soon as you interact them and say, like, is it a Bernese Mountain Dog? Or is it a pug? Or what is it? They're asking for that information very, very directly. And that's often underlooked as a very simple and basic thing that you can do to start to capture some information. Sometimes those questions are very personal, right? Maybe sometimes too personal. I don't know if I want to tell you how much my house is worth, but maybe if you're actually trying to solve a problem, even if you're collecting, PII, which is a technology person, I'm always cautious about the notion of collecting that information. I might be willing to share that because you're going to address a specific need that I've come to you to try and figure out, okay? Mobile is another place where we see tremendous expansion capabilities around personalization, combining together an understanding of where people are past behavior interactions with the brand. So Warby Parker does a great job of this, knowing my measurements, so when I visit with my mobile device, I don't have to go through my email and find that information and share it with them, whatever. They know it, and so when I select my next pair of frames, I've got that information on hand. Or this in-network opportunity or advertisement from Macy's where they're taking your past purchase behavior, but also combining that with location data so they can offer you a very relevant, specific, localized ad. And then sort of the most brute force localization is inside the Waze app where you're getting ads for things that are close by your actual physical proximity and location. Location is a really, really underutilized area for personalization. This is a simple way to match together location data and weather to use personalization in a way that allows this UK retailer to sort of say, hey, I know what it's like outside. Here are the things that you might be specifically interested in. And knowing also where you are in the purchase process, again, becomes a big thing in e-commerce and in retail, because I think awkward does not begin to describe, ladies and gentlemen, the process of shopping for pants for a person with my genetic superpowers of short and squat. And so having this kind of specific advice at times like this is an empathetic kind of personalization that really works. It's simple, it's not particularly technically complex, but it does the trick and it knows where I am in the process. And that should continue not just before purchase, but after purchase as well, right? Casper does a great job of this. This is retargeting. After I've made the purchase, I want to extend your relationship with my brand. I know that you've bought the bed. Now here's the next thing that you can buy. It's also true in a somewhat under-focused area in personalization around nurturing, right? Whether that's email or other retargeting sorts of activities, where it's also important to take that past pattern of behavior and interaction and understanding. This is a startup that does crowdfunding for matching donors and nonprofits, and they're suggesting specific things that you could donate to based on what you've done before. So we have all of these different examples of personalization. What's involved in this? What are the sets of capabilities? And what are the domains in which we have to play to actually do personalization? So first and foremost, you have to have some capability to track. It doesn't need to be creepy style tracking, but you have to have some ability to connect particular types of behaviors and interactions in some way that's reasonably coherent. You should be able to personalize inside your ads, and whether that's things like dynamic creative optimization or just different types of campaign planning or audience buying. You should be able to personalize in the interaction between those ads and the landing pages that those clicks end up on. This is a highly under-leveraged area where connecting those two things and personalizing together is really, really important and really pretty straightforward to do. Your sites, so whether that's for research or engagement or actually transactions, you should be able to personalize there. In the call center, Alicia talked about a little bit earlier, the idea that this is an important place to connect with your consumer, and frankly, nothing is more pleasurable when on the phone with a call center agent to know the 3 or 4 steps that you've run through before you're actually talking to them so you don't have to repeat yourself. That is extremely powerful personalization. Same thing applies if you're a business that has folks in the field selling and making appointments and closing deals there. And certainly in retail, where the ability to pull data from digital domains into what's happening in the store creates unique opportunities to really know that customer. And finally, in nurturing, right? So in nurturing context, you're using all that information, as we saw with that crowdfunding example, to really make sure that the ongoing interaction with the brand takes account of the past interactions that you've had and uses information that you've gleaned or derived in the process of interacting with that consumer to give them ongoing messaging that makes them feel like you understand them and that you're being relevant. All this heavily, heavily dependent upon data, right? So if you can't gather the data from all these different interaction touch points, it doesn't really mean much. And so when I think about what the keys are to actual implementation, it is between these two ends, right? It is between that ability to track and understand what's happening across all these touch points and the ability to gather that data, and to gather that data in a highly usable way, okay? So how does it actually implement, right? How do we actually put these pieces in place? Well, for the most part today, implementation of personalization kind of boils down to those sets of touch points where you can personalize and a bunch of software, right? And that software may be the major marketing cloud providers, Adobe, Oracle, Salesforce, or there may be specialty providers in a particular area like Flash Talking for dynamic creative optimization or Dialog Tech for call analytics or whatever the case may be. But for the most part, the actual personalization implementation is happening on the basis of a set of rules. They're like if-then statements. If Jeremy bought this type of bag, then perhaps I would want to offer him things that might be related to that bag as opposed to beating him over the head with the same bag 20 different times over the course of the month. Those are pretty straightforward, and that's a lot of what the personalization software does today. But actually making it happen, I want to suggest to you, is about a lot more than software and touch points. Making it work is about more than those things. If any of you have actually done personalization at scale in ways that aren't just sort of small scale stuff, you will know it is not easy to do. Raise your hand if you feel or have done stuff where you think personalization is easy or straightforward. Yeah, see, no one's lying. It's good. Okay. So it is a hard thing to do. And the reason that it's a particularly challenging thing to accomplish is because all of the components involved in doing this well and doing this at scale tend to be isolated from one another. And it's not an isolation on purpose. It's an isolation that's based on the fact that tackling these individual problems of all those different touch points and the technology required to use them, the tracking that has to kind of connect, the data that you have to collect, those are all hard things. And so as humans, we generally will take, or maybe it's just nerds, we'll see, we take difficult problems and we chop them up into smaller bits. And then we attach a set of people to solve those individual bits. And so even if you're doing a good job, it's kind of a fractal problem, right? So if I'm trying to personalize my ads, there's a whole set of individual and specific needs and requirements and technologies around that and process, and the same thing on sites and landing pages. And so what you have is this challenge of connecting the pieces together. So as a result, most marketers, most honest marketers, will tell you that it's a real struggle. There are real barriers to doing personalization, period, and personalization at scale, much harder. And if you can't read the relatively small print in those graphs, the issues that kind of rise to the surface in all that feedback and in other research on personalization is that it's issues about knowledge and strategy, right? It's issues about how we use the data, the availability of data, the usability of the data, the technology, how it connects to one another, whether it's viable at all, whether it takes too long to put the pieces together, and increasingly working across channels or domains. It's not even just media channels, but it's just sort of different parts of the business. Now, if you ask yourself the question of all the people you've met here and all of your colleagues, they're all people with, I would argue, above average intelligence, grit, willingness to solve difficult problems. They have lots of data, they have lots of technology, but the challenge is getting that kind of collaboration to work together. And I'm not saying that this is a project management issue, I'm saying that in order to tackle problems around personalization, you have to be able to work across these different domains. And so if you take anything away from this talk, it should be the idea that in order to do personalization at scale, you absolutely must plan and implement holistically. That doesn't mean going to see special doctors and buying everything from Whole Foods. What I mean is you have to ask your internal teams, your agencies, your software providers, your other partners to work in ways that may not be comfortable or first nature to them, second nature, right? You have to ask everyone to think a little bit differently in order to take advantage of the opportunity to provide consumers with a really relevant personalized experience. And it means moving away from thinking about channels, whether those are media channels or conversion channels or sites, and I mean sites here in the sense of touch points, interaction points, and start thinking about events and experiences. The panel talked about this quite a bit. Right? Events and experiences means what are the actual things that the consumer considers to be occurring, not what I map out as to be the case. These are the events that matter to me in my funnel. But what are the things that they consider to be happening? And how are those individual events stitched together into a broader sense of experience that I have with a brand that I either feel positively, negatively, or worse, indifferent about? Okay? So what happens all too often is when confronted with the complexity and the collaboration issues and a lot of awesome technology, very, very shiny objects that do particularly interesting things for personalization, a lot of teams generate a lot of noise and not that much signal in terms of personalization, right? So they achieve personalizing of a particular touch point, but they are not achieving something that's real and essential. And we all know what that feels like, right? When you have that kind of interaction. That matters. And so the only way that we've really been able to characterize this properly is that the technology works great. Like, given enough time and money, you can accomplish personalization, right? But the challenge isn't really building it. The challenge is understanding all that complexity of human behavior. Can you effectively conceptualize what's going on in such a way that you're able to construct the event data stream and that set of experiences in a way that you know where and when and in what ways to personalize your interaction? It's a hard thing to do. The only way that we've been able to figure out how to do this at scale is to take a skill that we all learned, depending on where you grew up, in junior high school or high school, and that is the experimental method. It's very simple, and it has produced all the technology that we're talking about today, right? The idea here is not just that you're running tests, because it's pretty cheap and easy today to run tests, to validate whether the red button or the blue button works, or this creative versus that creative. And that's wonderful, and that has its place. But personalization is about solving a bigger and more challenging issue. And so when we look at how to tackle the complexity of understanding personalization, understanding consumer intent and behavior, we have to construct tests that allow us to validate or invalidate hypotheses about what matters to people, right? That have emotions and feelings and lots of other things going on that have nothing to do with our brand or the specific problem that we're trying to solve for them. So a test is a hypothesis about what works. And at the end of it, not only should you be able to have more sense of what's real and what matters for your consumer, and hopefully you've generated some value in terms of ROI or benefit and revenue or understanding, but critically, you have an understanding of what the next test will be, of what the next hypothesis should be. And so what you get is this successive generation of hypotheses about what matters to groups of consumers or even individual consumers that you can do to implement personalization. And it allows you to prioritize. Being pragmatic means using the process of generating hypotheses in this kind of ongoing learning journey in a way where you start in places that you really understand the problem well. Maybe the technology is more mature, or it's a well-defined problem, or it's a limited constraint, one specific channel or one particular type of consumer, or whatever the case may be. But be pragmatic. The hypothesis formation process, the testing process, they don't have to be giant involved things, but they accumulate over time so that you understand more and more about what will work and how to construct the next best experiment and go on from there until you have a new set of assumptions about how to personalize best for your consumer. Now, the stakes are high. I don't think I have to belabor the point. It's been talked about all day today. This is a sort of synthetic set of averages across a number of clients and consumers over the last probably 5 years, where we see meaningful benefits in terms of conversion in media, conversion in sites, revenue, return on ad spend rather, CPL. Like, these are real benefits. But as Sam and Jackie talked about, I mean, I can argue stats at you all day, every day, and talk about the money, and it's important. But at the end of the day, I think it's about courtesy. We all know what it feels like when we have a relevant, well-personalized interaction with a brand. It's very harmonious. And when brands don't do it, it's discordant. And I think at this point in time, it's not 10 years ago where you could get away with this kind of stuff based on your brand value or just your size. You have to be courteous to your consumer in such a way as they feel that sense of harmoniousness, because a distorted, sour note that a brand sounds, well, it's just too easy. Moving to someone else, going somewhere else is just one tap away, right? And that's really, at the end of the day, what we're trying to accomplish. It requires more, as Gerd was talking about, it requires a little bit more emotional intelligence than purely IQ. So hopefully a little bit less anxious, maybe a little bit more focused, I'd turn to this question of, how do we use personalization to prepare for the future? And as I talked about a few minutes ago, if we start thinking about events and experiences as opposed to individual touch points or the specifics of them, we're going to gather through experimentation, hypothesis forming, like a bunch of things. We're going to uncover a bunch of information about people and a bunch of information about their attributes and the interactions that they have, and all these constitute very useful data sets. And all of those data sets matter a lot because all of the new marketing technology, whether it's voice, augmented reality, you pick your category, all of this technology, all 5,000 MarTech providers, they want one thing in order to work very well, and that one thing is data about consumers, that same set of event data and interactions about people and their attributes. And no piece of marketing technology wants that data more than artificial intelligence. Now, I've been building machine learning software for personalization for about the last 5 years. And I can tell you that the use of different data sets to train predictive models around personalization or just for general conversion optimization, there is no richer, more powerful, more comprehensive set of data to use as training data, right? Literally the data that trains the AI to predict what's going to happen than the data that comes out of personalization experiments. That is a fact. So to be prepared for that, figuring out how to do personalization at scale is essential because there are certainly brands who've begun to figure that out and begun to figure it out at scale. But the last thing, again, goes back to thinking about consumers and people, right? So personalization is something that we talk about doing for, hopefully not to, but for consumers. But the reality is that where things are going next is not so much about personalization, but about individualization. It's another shift in the balance between brand and consumer, further tilting toward the consumer, where we're not going to do personalization for them. They, us, all of us in the room, based on knowing what we want and having tools made available to us either by brands or by other providers, will set the dance routine. We'll tell the brand, this is what we want, this is how I want to interact with you, these are the pieces that I need, this is how I want it to work. And if we don't know how to run experiments, if we don't know how to capture information about people, if we don't know how to do personalization when we are controlling the direction, we will not be able to do it when it's happening in the reverse direction, when they reverse the polarity, right? So I want to end with a very brief and modest proposal to you based on what I've talked about in terms of personalization. And it's this. It's the idea that the people responsible for media should absolutely be taking on a leadership role as it relates to personalization. Now, this may seem particularly modest because many of you may say, well, that's happening today. But I would argue, politely, of course, that for the most part, not exclusively and not completely, but personalization from the perspective of how it happens in a brand is not as often being led by people responsible for media. And I would argue that that is a historical accident more than anything else. And the reason that it is a historical accident has to do with nerdy topics. It has to do with software and what software wants. And software wants to solve constrained problems, okay? If you go back to the set of marketing technology providers, you'll note one thing, if you can even make it out. And that is that within this landscape, there's probably 5 or 6 major categories and a number of subcategories within those, and there are subcategories within those subcategories. And that's a good thing because to ship quality software, you have to be able to solve a well-defined problem, right? It's like we talked about this morning in Amazon in terms of teams are oriented around features end to end, and that's a great thing. It makes the software better. It also, not coincidentally, allows you to achieve product market fit, which allows you to raise money, which allows you to one day become a unicorn, right? So the software wants to work in that particular way. Now that's all good, and it produces a lot of innovation and a lot of value for all of us, but what it also does is it changes the nature of the problem to suit the software rather than adapting the software to the nature of the problem. What I mean by that is that when we think about personalizing, we don't necessarily need to start with what happens on the website or in the email or in the call center or even in the store. I would argue that we need to start thinking about the people, right? The audiences. Who is it that we're trying to talk to? And that is where people with leadership roles in media really begin. And if we think about the effort of personalization being about understanding those audiences and people and what makes them tick and their emotional responses to particular things and their behavioral responses, well, that will make it better. Because if we don't have media leadership, what we get is what I think is the case for the most part with many, many brands. And that is that the personalization process is disconnected. It's disconnected from the business strategy at times. It certainly becomes disconnected from the audience strategy, planning, and definition process, as Sam and Jackie talked about. It becomes disconnected from the day-to-day ad ops and campaign execution, where we're not thinking about personalization as we're trafficking everything and planning everything. And I think worst of all, when clicks cross this sort of air gap, when we lose all this context and understanding of who we're trying to talk to that exists in media, and we end up on sites and we've lost all that context, or whatever the next touch point may be where we've lost all that context, we're not doing personalization right. And that means that there has to be media leadership and ownership more than there has been, generally speaking, around personalization. So my modest proposal to you is this. There are brands out there, some in this room, who have stood up and said, and I've been in these conversations in the last 12 months, that they feel it is their responsibility, it is their duty to say, I need to be able to direct how this works because my area of responsibility is where everything starts. And so my suggestion to you is to follow their lead, to begin that process because it will work better. And let's get started. Thank you very much. you.